This is a story of bravery and hardship. It is the story of the 1913 Canadian scientific expedition to the Arctic and of the former whaler Karluk, an expedition that went tragically wrong. On board the Karluk were a number of Inuit hunters and their families, including 2 young children, 10 scientists, and 13 crewmen. Amongst these were Hugh Williams, a sailor from Newborough on Anglesey, and a meteorologist and magnetologist, William Laird McKinley. It's from the letters of Hugh Williams and a personal testimony by McKinley that we're able to piece together the compelling story of the Karluk and of the men who battled the elements to stay alive. The expedition was led by the renowned Arctic explorer Wilhelm Stephenson. Stephenson's expedition was intended to research the Inuit people and to discover new land for Canada beneath the ice. He had 3 ships, the Mary Sachs, the Alaska, and as lead ship, the Karluk. It was the largest staff of specialists to ever accompany a polar expedition. William McKinley, originally a schoolteacher from Glasgow, recalls getting the telegram that changed his life.
Well, I got a telegraph on the 26th of April 1913, signed by Stephenson, asking if I'd be willing to join an expedition as a magnetic observer, lasting 4 years. No salary, but all expenses paid.
Hugh Williams grew up on the family farm on Anglesey, but by 1912, aged 24, he had become disillusioned with farming and decided to go to sea, and eventually arrived in Vancouver, where the Karluk was fitting out for her journey into the Arctic wastes. The Karluk was soon at sea, heading for Alaska. Hugh Williams wrote home to his family in Anglesey.
Juneau, Alaska, June the 24th, 1913. Anwyl Dad a Mam, I'm taking the pleasure of sending you word, hoping that you are well, as I am at present. We arrived here today and will be leaving port tonight. The ship is called Karluk. We're going to look for new lands under the ice, so this will be a very cold trip. I'll be coming home once I've finished this job. Mam, cofiwch fi at bawb yn Newborough. That's all for now, Mam. Remember me to all in Newborough. I send my best wishes to you. I am your son, Hugh.
The 3 ships departed Alaska in late July 1913. They soon separated, the Mary Sachs and the Alaska heading south. Stephenson's intention was to use the Mary Sachs as a supply vessel for the Karluk, which, as per his plan, immediately sailed northwards. Tom Rippeth, Professor of Ocean Physics from the School of Ocean Sciences at Bangor University.
The Karluk headed north through the strait that separates Vancouver Island from Vancouver, past the Queen Charlotte Islands and up the Pacific coast of Alaska. And when she got up to that point, she would have turned into the Bering Strait, which would have taken her from the Pacific between Alaska and Siberia and into the Arctic Ocean.
There was an unusual mixture of knowledge and inexperience amongst the crewmen on board the Karluk. Some had been part of Shackleton's British Antarctic expedition. Others, like Hugh Williams, were travelling into the ice fields for the first time. John Jennis from Vancouver, British Columbia, is the grandson of Diamond Jennis, one of the 10 scientists on board the Karluk. He was an ethnologist and a pioneer of Canadian anthropology.
It's hard to imagine coming from New Zealand and New Guinea previously, as Diamond did, dressed in traditional clothes of the time. A scientist would wear a jacket and waistcoat and suit and tie and would have a hat, often smoking a pipe, with tall laced-up shoes, embarking upon a polar expedition, not really being fully cognizant of just how cold and trying, bitter, howling winds that they would encounter in such a very short order.
Captain Robert Bartlett from Newfoundland, the man at the helm of the Karluk, was a veteran of the Arctic. Stephenson was a highly experienced Arctic explorer, but nonetheless this 1913 expedition was arguably badly planned and disorganised. John Jennis again.
Much has been written about the deficiency and disorganization of the planning for the expedition. Bartlett, who was selected at the last minute to captain the Karluk, surprisingly did not even get a chance to select his own crew. In the words of McKinley, the crew had been picked up along the coast. The conditions sailing northward on the Karluk, certainly from Nome, Alaska northward, were absolutely atrocious. She was so deep in the water with heavy cargo that her decks were nearly awash.
The Karluk was expected to reach Herschel Island in the Beaufort Sea around the middle of August, where the serious scientific work of the expedition would begin. In fact, the Karluk, the lead ship of the whole expedition, ran into sea ice barely 2 weeks into her voyage. William McKinley.
The ice was thickly packed and little or no progress could be made. We ultimately got along the coast halfway between Point Barrow and our rendezvous at Herschel Island.
So how suited was the old Karluk for such a perilous voyage? William Laird McKinley again.
The trouble just then, when we got halfway along the coast, was that the real deficiency in the ship showed itself up. Because she'd been built not for Arctic exploration at all, she'd been built as a fishery collecting ship. It was midsummer, all the new ice had melted, the snow had melted, the older ice was rotten, and with a ship which had more power and more weight than the Karluk, as Bartlett said, he could have ploughed through that ice, but she was too weak.
On the 20th of September, Wilhelm Moore Stephenson decided it was essential to secure fresh meat for the expedition while conditions allowed, before the onset of winter. An expert hunter himself, he took a party which included 2 Inuit hunters, the scientists Diamond Jennis, Bert McConnell, George Wilkins, and a team of huskies and sledges. His intention, he stated, was to hunt for caribou and return in 10 days. John Jennis again.
There are differences of opinion as to whether Stephenson abandoned the ship or whether he was acting responsibly in going ashore to hunt to feed the dogs and the men on the ship. It resulted in a lifelong campaign by Dr. Anderson, who was the leader of the Southern Party, who felt that Stephenson had basically mismanaged the whole expedition. Interestingly enough, Diamond was a crack marksman and had been on the rifle team at Oxford, and he could bring down a caribou at over 500 yards. So it's quite understandable from perhaps Diamond's view to go with Stephenson and a hunting party and then to return to the Karluk in a 10-day period.
Whatever his intentions, 3 days after their departure, fierce gales whipped through the region, and when the weather cleared, the Karluk had gone, pushed out to sea by a fast-moving ice floe.
As a result, neither Stephenson nor my grandfather had a clue about where the Karluk actually was. They did not know of the fate of the Karluk for many years.
Stephenson and his party continued with their journey. You're listening to BBC Radio Wales. I'm Phil Carradine, and this is the story of the Canadian Arctic expedition of 1913. Welsh filmmaker Dilwyn Jones recorded William Laird McKinley in 1983.
When we got abreast of Point Barrow, the 2 huge ice fields coming together produced a terrifying and dangerous spectacle. The large floes in both currents would pile one on top of the other and break up into pieces as large as a house, and one part of it pushing until the upper one rose and rose and rose until it was vertical, and then the top would snap off in huge chunks until one had an inferno of whirling, breaking, creaking ice. And the noise was beyond description. Sometimes a thunderous boom from far away, and then near at hand a tiny twanging like the touching of a wire.
Tom Rippeth, Professor of Ocean Physics at Bangor University.
The pressure on the ice, or the ice sheets being pushed by the ocean currents together, is absolutely huge. And you get the feeling of that from McKinley's description, because the ship is almost sort of like a matchstick, having great forces pushing together on both sides.
With the ice grinding against the hull of the Karluk and the pressure on her hull building by the moment, Captain Bob Bartlett knew that the ship's demise was imminent. On Boxing Day, they set up a camp and food store on the ice. Wearily, they built snow houses and stockpiled everything they would need to survive.
Just about the end of the first week in January, the weather worsened, and there was a succession of gales of great intensity. All preparations were made for a quick getaway. And I was awakened one morning by a harsh, creaking sound just alongside my bunk. Mayman was beside me, and I said, "This is the end, boy, I'm getting out." When I got to the top of the engine room steps, there was a gap in the hull about 10 feet long, and the water was pouring into the engine room, and the skipper immediately gave orders to abandon ship.
In his cabin, Bartlett wound up his treasured gramophone and played the solemn tones of Chopin's funeral march. It was a fitting end for the old ship.
And then there came the moment when he saw that he had to move, and stepped onto the ice, leaving the record playing. And as the ship settled down, the last thing we saw was the Canadian ensign spread on the surface of the water, and she went down on an even keel, while Bartlett stood by shouting adios. Then we all retired to shipwreck camp.
Months later, from his hospital bed, Hugh Williams recalled the demise of the Karluk in one of his letters to his parents.
Well, ma'am, the ship sank on the 10th of January, latitude 72 degrees north, about 80 miles from Wrangell Island, Arctic Ocean. We stayed near where the ship sank until the 20th of February. We lived in a house made of snow.
Marooned now at shipwreck camp, in temperatures of 40 degrees below, with limited comforts and faced by howling winds, life was tortuous. 24 men, even 2 children, were left to endure horrendous conditions. They slept with the sounds of shifting ice all around them. After a further 11 days of perpetual darkness, the sun returned. It brought new hope. 2 islands were spotted on the distant horizon, rocky Herald Island and the larger Wrangell Island. On the 21st of January, Bartlett sent men to look for shelter on Wrangell Island. It was a horrendous journey, dragging sledges over huge chasms and ridges of snow and ice. In appalling conditions, they finally realised they were on course not for Wrangell, but Herald Island. Suffering from frostbite and exhaustion, the party split. One group returned to camp, the other kept on for Herald Island. The 4 men, Sandy Anderson, Barker, Brady and Golightly, were never seen again. The fate of Anderson and his comrades was not known until human remains were found on Herald Island 10 years later. Rifts began to erupt between the survivors. Some of the scientists felt that they knew the conditions better than Bartlett. They were, after all, men who had been to Antarctica with Shackleton.
Murray came to Captain Bartlett. He told the captain that he and Mackay and Bouchard wished to leave the next day.
Hugh Williams was not the only Welshman on board the Karluk. T. Stanley Morris, son of Robert Morris of Mould, was also serving on board the exploration ship.
One of the seamen, Stanley Morris, came to the captain and asked if he'd be allowed to go with the doctor. Captain gave his permission, and I got orders to equip them with 50 days' provisions.
They went without dogs, opting instead to drag the dead weight of the sledges behind them. Next, Bartlett sent out a party to search for the men from the Herald Island sledge. Included in this search party was Hugh Williams. He later recounted that he had actually seen the scientists, but that they would not return with him. Like the 4 men who had headed for Herald Island, all of the men in James Murray's party perished on the ice. Finally, Captain Bartlett decided to abandon camp and head for Wrangel Island, 100 miles distant. Huge walls of ice, perhaps many miles long, and temperatures well below zero faced them on their journey. In 6 days they'd covered just 3 miles, all of this with 2 young children in tow. In the end, the journey to Wrangel Island took 25 days. But now, for the first time in 8 months, they had land rather than the shifting ice pack beneath their feet. Hugh and the surviving members of the party settled down for a long stay on this uninhabited, hostile wasteland.
We reached Wrangel Island on the 12th of March, and we lived there until the 12th of September.
Conditions were still brutal, and Captain Bartlett decided that the only hope was to make the 700-mile walk to Alaska, taking the Inuit Katuktovik with him to seek help. The survival of the party now depended on their journey. With Bartlett gone, infighting and squabbling began to occur amongst men beaten down by poor food and by freezing conditions.
The only man who never had any difference with anybody was Clan Williams. He was an ideal person for that situation. He appeared to be as happy and contented a human being as you could wish to find anywhere. He was a wonderful companion. Not that you would ever get much out of him. I mean, he could chat, but only saying what had to be said.
There were fights and a shooting in which 1 man died. George Breddy suffered a fatal gunshot wound. But whether it was an accident, whether it was suicide, or whether it was murder, has never been established.
One of the instructions that Bartlett had left with us was that we should not remain all together in one camp, but should spread out a bit, so that we'd be able, in our hunting, to cover a great deal more ground. But Mayman and Mullach, partly because of all the differences and squabbling, Mayman was desperately anxious to get away.
Food was a constant problem.
We were very fortunate. We got a run of polar bears and cubs, which kept us going for quite a period. But when that was exhausted, we had nothing but pemmican. And everyone was utterly disgusted with it.
Pemmican, a commonly used concentrated mixture of protein and fat, was the staple diet of polar explorers, but it needed to be augmented by carbohydrates, only available to them in ship's biscuit. And they also needed to maintain regular supplies of fresh fish and meat. When the biscuit ran out, so too did the vital carbohydrates, and this resulted in horrific swelling of limbs and extremities.
When I arrived, I discovered Mullach had died just a few hours before I had arrived. I found Mayman in exactly the same state as Mullach. Both of them, as Mayman told me, had started swelling at the ankles just as I had done, and the swelling had spread up the legs right up to the waist. And Mullach's corpse and Mayman's body was a ghastly sight.
Hugh Williams gave a brief account in one of his letters.
We ate anything we could catch. Once we went for a fortnight without eating anything. I'm sorry to tell you that 3 have died on the island, and a further 8 are lost. And I'm the only seaman still alive. I'll never forget those 6 months.
frostbite had now become a major problem. Hugh himself fell through the ice and finished back at camp, wet through and shivering. Soon it was clear his feet were badly frostbitten. William Laird McKinley describes the consequences.
Clam, unfortunately, had to lose his big toe. It turned gangrenous. We had nothing, of course, in the way of surgical instruments. The only tool we had was a pair of tin shears. And just to make the job as easy as possible for Clam, we took measures to ensure that he didn't see what was going on and kept Clam's head turned away. The second engineer, Williamson, acted as surgeon. Clam remained for quite a long time pretty well helpless, had to be sledged here, there and everywhere. And finally, when he reached Victoria in due course, he had to remain in hospital for a while.
Anwyl dad a mam, da gennyf gael y sefyllfa hon o anfon. Dear dad and mam, I'm taking this opportunity of sending you a short note. I'm sorry to tell you that I've lost my big toe. It was frozen and we had to cut it off with a saw. That was the only thing we had. It hasn't healed yet. I'll have to go to hospital in Victoria. We'll be there in 3 weeks. I hope to be in Newborough for Christmas. That's all for now. Hugh.
Bartlett had said that we would all assemble at Rogers Harbour, and by the end of July he hoped to arrive with a ship. Well, the end of July came, no ship. Solid pack as far south as we could see. There didn't appear to be any hope of a ship arriving.
The Inuit woman Kirrick, Auntie as she was known, and the hunters devised an ingenious way to fish, using a pin attached to a line of sinew, dropping it through the ice into the water.
They didn't use any bait. They kneeled over this crack in the ice, and they could see the tomcod swimming by, and it was a case of keeping their hook underneath and attempting, as a tomcod swam by, to jerk it like that in the hope that the pin would catch it. Well, they did catch some. We decided that we'd get up early the next morning and all in our tent would go fishing for tomcod. And we'd been fishing for some hours, and the number of tomcod in the tin was growing quite generously.
At last they could look forward to a filling and satisfying dinner. But then came the moment they'd all been waiting for.
Karluk went out to get another piece of driftwood, and he was no sooner out than there was a shout, "Umiak pak kano," which meant maybe a ship. And sure enough, just coming beyond Cape Waring was this little schooner.
The ship was the King and Wing, a small Canadian commercial vessel trading around the northern coast of the country.
She'd gone about another half mile when down came her sails. Hanley sent Karluk scooting over the ice to try and intercept them, and he started blazing away with his rifle. But we saw a bunch of men putting over the side of the schooner and come ashore. By this time, Kirrick and the two kids had their pan of cod half filled. And I said, "I don't know about you, Harley, but I'm having a feed of fish before we leave this island." And although the men came ashore, we stopped long enough to eat our fish.
A few days later, another ship, the Bear, also hove into view. On board her was Captain Robert Bartlett, who, with the Inuit Katuktovik, had walked 700 miles across ice packs and frozen landscapes. Newfoundlander Captain Bartlett continued to sail and returned to the Arctic many times. He died in New York City in 1946. Diamond Jennis continued his valuable work on Inuit ethnicity. John Jennis again.
After he returned with the rest of the scientists of the Southern Party in the summer of 1916, Diamond Jennis went to work at the Geological Survey, and in the spring of 1917, Diamond enlisted and went to fight in the First World War. He returned and subsequently ended up marrying his boss's secretary. That was my grandmother. Diamond spent the rest of his career working and writing about Indigenous people across North America and particularly Canada. My grandfather passed away peacefully on a snowy November morning just north of Ottawa, overlooking the Gatineau River.
And what of expedition leader Stephenson, the man who left the Karluk when she became lodged in the ice? To many people, he was regarded as a hero. To others, he was vilified for what they saw as poor planning and his decision to leave his men on the ice floe. However you regard him, he went on to lead several more expeditions and became a renowned figure in polar exploration. Hugh Williams wrote home to his family in Anglesey.
St Joseph Hospital, Victoria, British Columbia, December the 5th, 1914. Anwyl dad a mam, dyma fi yn cymryd y pleser I ateb eich caredig. I have the pleasure in replying to your kind letter, which I received the other day. I was glad to receive it and to hear that you are all well, as I am at present. I am very sorry that I'm not able to be home for Christmas. I'm still in hospital. Would you please tell Harry and Owen that I'll write to them soon when my leg is better? Remember me to everybody in Newborough. I was surprised to hear that Willie T. Muldan got married. I'll have to look for a wife when I get home. So that's all for now. I send you my very best wishes. I am your son, Hugh. Good night, Ma'am.
You would have thought that his experiences would have put Hugh Williams off life as a sailor forever. Not a bit of it. He served in the Merchant Navy throughout the Great War, surviving the sinking of yet another ship. Afterwards, he married a Newborough girl and had 3 children. He died aged 49 in 1937. This programme is dedicated to the memory of Hugh Clam Williams from Newborough on Anglesey. Farmer, seaman, Arctic survivor.